About to find out exactly what we mean when we say debut. Here we are with debut, and we have a debut storyteller, but has long been in practice as a storyteller. In fact, story is in his blood. Whether he's in England, America, or traveling, he specializes in folk and fairy tales and myths and legends, and he has traveled all over, including the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival. I encourage you to check out his book, Under the Oaken Bough. But today we are fortunate because we have this storyteller here. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome for Simon Brooks.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad that you're here. And I'm really looking forward to debut with Kevin Cordy as we work through some stories together. Hey, Kevin, how you doing?
I'm good. Yourself?
Not too bad, not too bad. So how many times can we use the word debut?
There we
You got
go.
both.
Hey, Simon
Yay!
Brooks. Good to see
Wow,
you.
I'm going to back off a bit because I'm huge in the picture. I'm going
Welcome.
to dominate. Hi.
Welcome to what we know as
Debut. So in case any of you out there have missed the title of this show, it is called Debut.
And if we had to do the subtitle, it would be a fusion of storytelling and play. But before we start talking about that, Simon, tell us about your road as a storyteller.
Well, I'll give a very brief road because it's quite a long one. Now I'm this old, but I always wrote stories. I always wrote stories, and as I got older, I started to send them to publishing houses and publishing companies and whatnot. And I got lots of rejection slips and some good suggestions. And then one day, I was taken by a school group to go and see a storyteller in England, in just outside of Hastings in Battle, where the Battle of Hastings took place. So, and it was in, I was running youth hostels at the time. And so what I was doing at these youth hostels, I'd be telling stories that I'd written to the kids, and I'd be like marking down where they're getting bored to tighten it up and all that kind of stuff. So using them as guinea pigs for my written work. And then when I went to see the storyteller, Eric Madden, I was just blown away by him. And I was like, how, this guy must be rich if he's just like goes and tells stories to people, because there's no way that people pay you for that. And then several years later, after continuing telling story, I started telling folk and fairy tales and myths and legends at the youth hostel after that, because I thought these stories are way better than my own stories. And I started to tell stories at the youth hostel. And then when I came over to the States, I was telling stories to my wife's nephews and nieces. And then I ended up being a stay-at-home dad and became a storyteller at a library. Well, I became a feral children's librarian, untrained, unqualified in paper. And I started telling stories on the mommy circuit, spread my name to other libraries, and I ended up doing about 5 libraries. And I was charging, because I really believed that nobody could charge to do this job, I was charging $25, no mileage, and I was driving like 45 minutes to some of these libraries. And then I got this big old book appear on my desk as children's librarian, which was a list of all performers, including storytellers, and how much they charge. And I was like, oh, people pay that much. And I knew that I was good enough to hire, because the mommy circuit had spread my name around. And so I got on the next showcase and said, this year I'm charging $95, but next year it'll be $195. And I was booked out, and I've never looked back since.
Excellent. There's a rich Valentine story.
There is.
And we've all started that way. I remember one of my very first gigs was 6 hours in a coffee house with very little breaks, because nobody knew what storytelling was. I was just starting out, and I didn't have 6 hours of material. So at the end of the 3rd hour, they said, I think we need to sell some coffee. And I learned to break it up after that a little bit,
Yeah. It was for me. It was great training ground because what I did was, I had a pretty small repertoire, and so what I was doing, I would go in and tell new stories, and then I would read from the books. So it was a combination of like reading and telling stories. But then, and it was, I was basically working every single week at these different libraries, right? And so I would try and learn a new story every week to come back to this library. But it would, it takes a lot of work to learn one story. And you go and you tell the new story, and you might slip in one that the kids might not have remembered, or, oh, I like that story, let's hear that again. It's like, great. And so that's how I built up my repertoire very quickly, because I had to.
And from the beginning, you've been using story as discovery. I mean,
Yes.
just
Hmm.
this worked, this didn't work. How important is that to you now?
Oh, it's still incredibly important. Um, Playing with story to I play with story to find what the meaning of it is. I mean, you can learn a story just straight from the book, and it's like, well, that's what the story is, so that's what I'm going to tell. But when you challenge yourself and look at different points of view from the characters, you look at the geographical region of the place. You might look at the history of the place, even, because those kinds of things play into the stories, right? I mean, if you look at the story of Stone Soup, which is a phenomenal example. If you look at the older versions, the Eastern European versions of this story, and then look at the history of war in Europe before 1750, this could be a true story, right? It might have been at some point a true story, because before 1715 there were no organized armies. They were basically people in the town and the village who were conscripted and forced to march. They weren't looked after. The horses of the officers were treated better than the soldiers, and they were often, emaciated, barefoot, barely clothed, because their clothes would, get cut up in the battles and whatnot. And they would go through these same villages and towns to go to a battleground, because different people wanted that one particular geographical spot, right? So they go through the same towns and the same villages, these massive armies, and they would take the food from these towns and villages. So when soldiers came back from war and were passing through them, if they were lucky, they weren't killed by the villagers, which happened often. And they people didn't want to know, because there was little enough food for themselves, because the soldiers had taken the food on the way out, and so the soldiers were absolutely hated, and the soldiers didn't want to be in there in the first place quite often.
So putting that context, story is. I often said stories is about. I wonder about this behind the story.
Right.
I imagine. I think imagine is. I wonder. I'm curious, and have you considered are powerful markers for story. And it sounds like even in your research, you're imagining all the time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because you look at these. I mean, some of the stuff you don't have to imagine too hard. I mean, I was doing an audio book of war in Europe before 1750, which is how I learned. And when I was reading this, I was like, this is what Stone Soup is all about. This is like the history of war condensed into a folk story, right? Without the backstory, of course. But the book that I read, there are these journal entries, and there are letters that clergy wrote to one another or back to family, in the 1500s and stuff. So we know that this is what happened. It's all, it's primary source history. But you wonder how these soldiers felt, taken away from their job, from their family, and a lot of these people back in those days, serfdom, they had to bring crops to the market to sell, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to pay the rent on their house, and the lords would take the house away and give it to somebody else, right? And so if you take the main breadwinner and send him off to war with the promises of riches, whatever spoils we find, but sometimes there weren't any spoils, and they weren't organized enough to bring food with them, and if one army has gone through a village and stripped it of everything, or even, sometimes they would burn the crops down, so there was absolutely nothing for anybody. A lot of these soldiers starved to death. It was terrible. And so there are these nuggets. When you do your research and you find these things out, it's like, well, why were the parents of Hansel and Gretel? Why were Hansel and Gretel thrown into the woods? Because starving to death is such a slow and painful death that it's better to die from the being ripped apart and being done with in a matter of minutes, a matter of moments in the woods, than dying a very slow and painful death of starvation. So there's all sorts of backstories to these tales.
So doing all that research gives it strength. I once heard
Mm-hmm.
Vi Hilbert, Saskia, the storyteller, she said that, we need to find the bones so that we can make the flesh. And
Mm-hmm.
so in your investigation, I've heard people say that, oh, well, just find 3 versions and you'll be able to tell what you need to tell. How do they
Mm-hmm.
undersell themselves? And the story, by the way?
Well, I'm not sure if they're underselling themselves, but they could explore the story a lot deeper by doing some of that research, and they can gain a lot more empathy with the story and the characters. They would bring more authenticity to the story. I think knowing where it comes from and what was going on in the region when these stories might have been told. So I don't think they're undercutting themselves. I think they're losing out on an added depth that one can bring to the stories. And you don't share all of this with the audience always. It comes out in the story when you know that stuff, because then if you know the background and the depth of where these people were coming from, you can interpret that for the audience in the telling of the tale.
And we have a firmer grasp on how to tell
Yeah.
that tale.
Right.
A lot of times when we just see storytellers perform their story, we think that that's the only process of the storytelling is the telling. What about the making process, which you're already talking about, and from a historical context, but also you've mentioned that you use play, and so how important is it for storytellers to talk about the making process?
For them to talk about it,
Right. Among storytellers. No, I mean, you don't have to tell the audience that you're telling.
Right. No, I think it's fun to, when I do my conversations with Storytellers podcast, if you don't mind me mentioning it,
Please, Fridays, I'm there. My cat
well, that as well. Friday with Friends.
I sent you a picture.
Right. So Friday with Friends is a little bit different, but the podcast, Conversations with Storytellers, I interview folk and fairy tale storytellers who are our elders, people that have been doing this for a long time. And it's interesting to find out the way that they tell a story. For example, Bobby Norfolk, right? He doesn't tell a story until he actually performs it. He just goes over it in his head. And the idea of stepping out onto a stage without those words coming out of your mouth even once before, for me, that's like that is crazy. Yeah, right.
But
that's crazy,
craft, isn't it? It's like people think that we all learn the same way, and we don't.
Right, and we don't.
The person that you had from Wales, and please give credit because I can't remember the name.
Carl Goff.
Yeah, I mean, you could tell he lives the story. He was talking about just looking on the landscape and moving the story and finding the story from there and doing the work of shaping the story from there. It was great to hear. If you haven't heard Simon's podcast, make sure you do.
Yeah, that's Friday with Friends, which is on. Okay, there's 2 different things there, so we'll make sure people understand. So yeah, Carl Goff, he, I think it's very similar to a lot of British storytellers. Like Liz Weir over in Ireland. She lives in the landscape of where these stories took place. Richard Marsh, who's actually from Chicago but has lived in Dublin now long enough to sound like a Dubliner and probably act like a Dubliner as well.
I'm reading Taffy Thomas.
And Taffy Thomas. I mean, I met him last year. Fortunately, my son and I flew over to England just before it got bad, and we flew back the day that America was shut down and they weren't letting foreigners back into the country. I mean, Aidan and I would have been fine, but anyway. But it was interesting because Taffy is another one of those people that lives up in the Lake District and lives in the landscape of the stories. And he's actually got a book where there's a map of where you can go and follow this story. And then there's the story itself that you read when you get to this place. So, I mean, you get to this cave up on the hillsides of the Lake District. And once you've had this wonderful walk, seeing these like stone walls carved through these like huge ravines, these huge gullies in the landscape, and you sit at this cave and you read this, and this is where the story took place. There's this, that you can feel the magic of the story. It's kind of like if you were to go, some people get the butterflies when they go into a library. Some people get the butterflies in their stomach if they go to a church or a cathedral, right? At least in the UK, or some other sacred places. If you go to some of the native spiritual places in Arizona, right? You walk into and you feel this vibration of energy there that gives you this respect for the place. And to sit in a cave and like read the story, or even when Taffy Thomas does it and he tells the story, you look into the cave and you're, well,
I'm there.
what's going to come out? It's just amazing.
Well, I'm reading his
Absolutely.
story about Wicklow, and I was in Glendalough there, and it was amazing to talk about a place that I have been, and then to read his story and to hear that story. And it's really important as storytellers. We talk about the practice. We talk about how the uniqueness. You said Bobby Norfolk kind of moves inside his head and then shares it
Yeah.
out. And I've worked with
Yeah.
Bobby, who's a living dynamo of energy.
Yes, he is.
And at the same time, we had people like Richard Chase or Jackie Torrance. They all had different ways. Some people, the way that they learn a story is they automatically go straight to print. And I always say that you need to word dance in the world that you are working in before you
Mm-hmm.
handcuff yourself to print. And so
Yeah.
what you're saying is go out in the landscape, see what's happening. And you know me as a person who loves to play. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's why debut came around. So what does play mean to you, Simon?
Play for me comes in different forms. Play for me could be, going for a walk in the woods with my dog Mo, and I'll tell the story out loud. We find there are some wonderful woods in and around New London, and hikes and trails and stuff. And so I take my dog out there, and I'll be talking to myself, I'll be working with the story. As you're walking through these trees and you see these huge rocks, and some of there are stone walls, and there are these cairns that are there, which could be, pre-European. And you see this magic, and that magic of the place that I'm in kind of draws itself into the story, or the story reaches out and pulls those pieces in. So that's one way that I play. Another way that I play, because I love using character voices. It's something that I've always done, and so sometimes I'll be looking for a character voice, and I'll play around with all sorts of character voices. There's one story that I used to tell quite often, which was the Big Toe, right? And every time it's for those people that don't know what the Big Toe is, I'm surprised you don't know, but it's okay.
Goes back for as
But
far as Mark Twain, doesn't it?
it does, yeah. It's based on, it's a campfire story that's based on the Golden Arm, which Mark Twain used to tell, and it was a folk tale when he was around. And so I kept doing this story, and I was trying all these different voices, and then one day I just couldn't find the voice for the story, and I was reading Wiley and the Hairy Man, right? And so I was like, once upon a time, there was this little itty bitty boy, and he went outside with his little itty bitty stick, because that was the only toy he had, and which I know is the worst American, like Southern, accent ever. But all of a sudden, the story started to speak to me, and it was like, oh my gosh, I got to do this terrible accent. I got to Kevin Costner this story. It's terrible, right? But it was like it. Because I did that voice, that the itty bitty boy came out, and he had an itty bitty toothbrush, and he had an itty bitty pillow, and he had like an itty bitty breakfast, and he had this itty bitty plate with his itty bitty knife and fork. That's what that voice brought the itty bitty into the story. And before that, I'd never told it like that. And it was like, all of a sudden, it was like, oh my gosh, this is it. It's popped. It's come alive now.
Wow.
And then you get to the Big Toe, and it's like, and when he was playing with his little itty bitty toy, his little itty bitty piece of wood in his itty bitty yard, he came across this big toe. Right. And then it just, you just play around with it and have fun with the story.
And that's critical, isn't it? Having fun.
Oh, yeah.
Simon,
Yeah.
you and
Yeah.
I, and not to interrupt, but you and I have a colleague and a friend in Odsbotkin, and I know he told
Yes, we
me
do.
once, he put his hands up here and he said, Kevin, look in the mirror. There's 1,000 voices right there. Not with your body, but from your head up, you can play. You can look in the mirror and you can go, yeah,
Yeah.
and just play. And
Yeah.
but I want you to finish the whole idea of play and the other variants that you use.
All right. So one of the things that I played around with, somebody suggested that, there's another story that I was struggling with, and they said, why don't you tell the story starting at the end of the story? And I was like, well, I could, but then I'd have to probably tell it in first person. And I was like, oh, what if I tell it in first person? And then it becomes, well, which character do I tell it as? And then it took another step from there, and it was just in dialogue. And I had heard, I had this cassette tape because I had a Volvo 240 DL with a cassette player in it at the time, and I found this cassette tape of I can't remember what it's called now, but it's one of J. O'Callahan's stories, and it's all in dialogue. And I was like, this is amazing. This is like surreal. This is like, wow. And when I was like doing the first person thing, I realized that I didn't need to do he said, she said, right? That these two men sitting in a room, sipping brandy, telling stories to each other. So all I need are two voices, and I can tell that whole story. And so I played around with it, which voice, started off as like telling it in the first person. And then, just playing around with it, it became a non-narrated story told in two voices. And so, by playing around with the story and trying different things out, it's kind of like, oh, let's try that. And let's try this.
And you
And
mentioned.
again,
Go ahead. Sorry.
going back to the character voices, sometimes you learn about the character when they're not in the story and you're walking around the kitchen, cleaning the counter or making breakfast for the family. And, I get really annoying to my family. Not many people could live with me because I'll be, the old man was making himself some breakfast, and I don't know why. And I'll be talking about this person, and it'll be one of the characters.
Dad, will you quit doing that?
Right. So I got this, like, why are you doing that, Dad? Well, I'm trying out a new character, son. What's this character about? Well, and I'll talk to my son in this character voice. And it's not method acting or anything like that. It's really not. It's just me goofing around, right? But something will come from that voice and that body that I've, stepped into with that voice. And something comes out of it. And I'm like, oh, this is a different point of view. I'd never really
What
thought
you
about.
said in the whole idea of goofing around, that play is not goofing around. That's the serious work that we do.
Yes, it is.
It's not a rehearsal for life. It's where we re-energize. It's where we revigorate, and our classical conditioning, which is how we were raised in school, lets us go, well, we write a paper, we don't let anyone see it until it's done, and then that's when we get feedback. But you and I have talked and talked often, and we often just play with voices and story and the times that we come together, and I find that extremely rewarding.
Yeah. Oh, it does. So a colleague of mine, Paul Strickland, he was working on a story, and he was having this problem with this character at the edge of this cliff. And I said, well, go and find a cliff and sit on the edge of the cliff and play around with that character while you're sitting there. Just, serious work, goof around. Just sit on the edge of that cliff and be that character. And I don't know if he did or not, but he must have, he came back and the story was like, he found it. Maybe because he imagined himself on the edge of a cliff, sitting there as that character and goofed around, did his serious work in play.
Exactly. And the whole thing is, it's not always word conscious. Silence creates sound.
Yeah.
The whole moment of being on that cliff. I recently was coaching. I coach I coach a group every week for the last 3 months. And I said, I want you to tell the story from an impact moment. Just start there and move the story. Let's get away from the plot frame. Let's go from the impact. And the story reversed and changed. And they found more what Catherine Boomer would call hidden gems in the story.
Right.
Isn't that great?
It's true. So I was trying not to get too close to the camera so I don't overwhelm people with my face. Yeah, right, exactly. So I was working in a school with a bunch of high school kids, and we were talking about Little Red Riding Hood. And it was like 2006, 2008, somewhere around there. And I was saying to these kids, like, who knows a folktale from beginning to end? And all the kids like, no. And I was like, come on, you got to know like Three Little Pigs, Little Red Riding Hood. And this girl put her hand up. So I know Little Red Riding Hood. I was like, all right. so you know it well enough that you could probably tell it from the end. And she misunderstood what I was saying and started telling the story backwards. Right? Which was really, I thought, was very impressive to start with. But I didn't realize that that's what she was doing. And I was like, well, that couldn't work because this person doesn't know what happened. And I said, unless they met in the belly of the wolf. And I was like, why don't we start with a story in the belly of the wolf?
Wow.
And so right there and then, right, I was like, that's just brilliant. Let's do this. And I said, that there was this old woman, and she's in this dark space, and she's pushing against the walls, and they're soft, and the place stank. It was the worst smell that she had ever experienced. And every once in a while, the whole space would move and rumble. Everything was damp. It was like slightly acidic smell. And then there was a great deal of movement. And then all of a sudden, something came and knocked against her. She wasn't alone in the darkness anymore. But what or who was that? And this little tiny voice said, I wish I'd listened to my mother. Oh, is that you, Little Red? What are you doing in here? Right? And all of a sudden,
I love
Little
that.
Red, right, it's an impact moment, right? And Little Red tells the story of what happened up to that point. And then they're, well, never mind, we'll find a way out. Let me think about it. And then, the wolf, this liquid comes pouring down, and he's like drinking some, oh, that's the red wine, Granny, right? This is an adult high school version of the story. And then, all of a sudden there's this bright light that shines down on them. And it's the woodsman cutting open the wolf, and all that light coming in because they've been in this darkness. And she pushes Little Red out, and Little Red's rescued. And then the huntsman pulls Granny out, and then we get back into the regular story. But
I love it.
But when you start to play around with things like that, and talking to other people like yourself, and I should be looking that way, except I wouldn't be looking. I'd be looking away from. So you're actually over there, but if I look here, it looks like I'm looking at you. So I'll start looking over there now, pretending I'm looking at you. But I know, yeah, right. See what I mean?
And then we're playing, and the whole
I know
idea
we are.
of Little
Red.
When my high schoolers were working with Little Red, it was Little Red in the Hood.
Yeah, right.
And the whole plot is boring. It's where trouble meets character, and when you're in the belly of you're that belly, and that wine is pouring down, that's what makes sense.
Yeah,
and nonsense makes sense too when you can play with the idea. So I'm going to lead to debut, because we've called this debut,
right? We have.
Where you're going to tell a story you've never told before in public. Why would you? Some people would call that a risk. Why would you? And I'm not one. I think it can be risky, but I think if we do that, we privilege the risk and not the fun. So why would you do that?
So I was given a book as a gift, and I was reading through the stories, and I found this love story in there. And I thought, this is a wonderful love story, but there's more to it than this book, because I feel that there's something wrong. There's something missing from it.
I love
it. And this comes with an experienced storyteller who's done a lot of reading and research. They'll read a story and they'll be like, there's more to this than meets the eye. Somebody who wrote this has missed out a whole bunch. So I went online and I was like, who knows the story of this particular character and this particular character? And here's a brief synopsis. And I got some people from India saying it's a story from the Mahabharata, which is a huge Indian epic.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a teeny tiny piece in this story. And the writer got the names wrong. They were very close, but they got it wrong. And I was able to go and find the story. And I've got two versions of it. I've got the Penguin version. I've also got I can't remember his name now, but he's a really good writer. He does a lot of these Indian epics. I can't think of it right now. No, it's not. If I hang on, I'm going to vanish behind my backdrop. And
while he's vanishing, we can see Simon's library, which is probably much more expansive, even beyond that red curtain.
No, well, these are all my folktale and fairy tale books. Now have you made me forget his name? I don't know. There are some names I remember. Ramesh Menon. He wrote a modern retelling of, as in modern vernacular, retelling of the Ramayana, which I loved. And he's also done a 2-volume book of the Mahabharata. And so I've got these two, the Penguin version, which is about this big, and then his version, Menion's version, which is huge and is 2 volumes and is very wordy and got all sorts of stuff in it that the Penguin version doesn't have. And I've read both of them, plus the other version. I've also gone onto Wikipedia and pulled some information about Wikipedia. And I've also talked to some people that I know in India about the story and the culture behind it and how it's viewed in India, which I think is really important because a lot of people in India see the story as serving a platitude that women should be subservient to the man. But what I saw when I read the story was this incredibly powerful woman doing this incredibly powerful work to save her husband. And I don't want to tell too much about it. Now, all I have done with this story is read these 3 versions and done a little bit of research. I have not yet committed it. It's still only in my head.
There's room for play.
There's plenty of room for play. I haven't started working on this story yet because when you invited me to do debut, I was thinking I could let's play with this particular story and I didn't want to undo anything, so I haven't done anything to undo other than read. And so I'm very excited. So this is going to be me. You'll be witnessing me learning in the raw this story from India, from the Mahabharata.
And
Which
the motto, the beauty is the beginning. There's beauty
yeah,
in the beginning. And this is the beginning from an experienced storyteller like Simon. And then at the same time, he's going to play with me with the story for 10 minutes. He can take my suggestions, whatever he wants to do, because that's what it is. And the people that are watching can suggest as well. And hopefully you'll walk away with a great suggestion box.
Yeah, right. And that's what I'm hoping. So my work to do before we get up there is to actually get the main points of the story down so that when I tell it to you or do, a short 10-minute telling of it, then because I have a feeling it might be a bit more of a 20-minute story than a 10-minute story, which is what I always do this. Like someone says, Simon, have you got a 5-minute story? I'm like, well, maybe one. You might have heard it before because I only have one. Because I tend to deal with these lengthier stories because
there's some grace in the time, but not 20.
Yeah. No, I know. So my plan is to start off with a 5-10 minute story and then see how it grows.
So Simon,
and I'm excited. I'm also scared witless, but I'm also I'm also very excited.
We don't let fear be the motivator.
No, we don't. We jump off the edge.
And it's in condition of play, and in play we can make mistakes, we can take risks. If you say go out and play, somebody thinks that's not work. It's really work, but it's good and it's fun and it's collaborative and it's supportive and it's co-creative. And I'm so glad that you're involved and one of the first to be on debut.
I'm excited, and I know that, I've done one of your workshops before, so I trust your process completely. And basically, we have very similar processes. I think there are some differences, but the play part of it, we're both very much in tune with each other.
and it's changed over the years, but it still stays with that the whole idea of sharing and moving together.
Yeah.
Within the story. Simon, why should people come?
Well, they could see me make a fool of myself. That's always worthwhile watching.
Or create a gem.
But I think it's really important to see how different people work in their creative process, because even if it's not a process that anyone watching would want to do themselves, it might give them an idea. It's like, oh, I don't like that, but it's given me this idea that maybe I could do this instead. Because it's stories beget stories and ideas beget ideas, and even if you don't like what I'm doing or what Kevin's doing, then there still could be something for you out there to learn.
Right.
I think anyway.
Take something from it, and
right.
We're just in this interview alone, we're talking about the practice. We're talking about story making and storytelling, and I've learned just from listening to you today.
Well, thank you very much.
And I can't wait. When is this date?
It's the 25th, I
28th.
think, or 28th. I was close.
At 2
I was
o'clock.
close.
No worries. I'll put up a link. It's no problem. But Simon, it has been a.
It's on the 28th of February at 5 o'clock Eastern time. We've got to mention Eastern time because there are people all over the world who might be tuning
actually,
in.
it's 2 o'clock at Eastern time. So I may cut this bit, but we'll see what happens.
Why don't you ask me that question again? Or not, just leave it in because this is what play is all about.
It is. And we'll
So
make
it's
sure
2 o'clock
everybody knows
Eastern
how to
time.
get there.
Yes, we'll put a big banner so you can say, don't listen to Simon. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Simon Brooks, an amazing storyteller who's willing to share the practice, the art, and tells commanding stories because he does the research. He spends time in play. He listens to others. And like he just said, he learns from the giants, and he's giving tribute to that on his own podcast, which I encourage you to go to. And he's part of Debut. And Simon, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Don't trust me on dates, but trust me on story. Be there. Debut.